One. Good morning, and if you can hear me, I'll apologize for the scratchy sound of my voice. It's not the microphone, it's me. I'm going to start with a question that I'm not going to answer right away. It's a question that the person on the screen will recognize very well. If bone is the answer, then what is the question? I'll come back to this. I want to thank everybody here for their presence, participation, engagement, and interest in last night's program. I thought it was a fantastic introduction, kickoff to this day, bringing out lots of the really important big issues, and most of all, filling at least the people that I had an opportunity to talk to about it last night, filling them with enthusiasm for the next 8 hours. So fasten your seatbelts. Just some announcements before we pick up intellectually where we left off last night. To begin just with logistics, on the screen is Peter Fratzel, and he'll be joining us from Berlin on a video link that is almost but not quite synchronous. So we have to allow for a little bit of transatlantic ether to pass by. That will also mean that between the presentations this morning, there'll be a little bit of software choreography, screens being shared, mics being muted and turned on. So bear with that little bit of clunkiness. So that's the first logistics, an ordinary kind. The second logistics is not an ordinary kind, and a sad kind, and that's Robert van Lange is not with us today because his mother died last week, and the funeral is today. So it's very sad. As you'll hear later, he was really part of the origins of this about 13 months ago, and we're sorry to miss him, though we're very grateful to have with us two guests, one from the Rijksmuseum, one from the Mauritshuis, Njenke Woltman and Abby Vanderveer, who will step into some part of his very large shoes this morning, and we're grateful to them for doing that pretty much at the last minute. A word about the room. The way we're going to play it over the course of the day is the panel that is at bat, so to speak, will sit at this closed end of the room, and then at the end of that panel, they will have to vacate and relocate to a different part of the table, and the next panel will fill this spot. So it'll be a little bit of submarine-style rotation. There are bathrooms downstairs. Leave the room at this end through that door. That door has an alarm on it. You don't want to do that. And that door in the front weighs about 1,000 pounds. Don't do that either. And this door is sealed like a bank vault, so you can't get through there. We're going to go pretty much continuously. We'll follow the program. There'll be breaks. If you want to go in between the breaks, feel free to do so. There will be food remaining outside if you need sort of sugar to maintain your intellectual composure. It'll be there for you. Next bit of logistics, gratitude. First and most of all to Laura Minsky, who's sitting at the end of the table, our Associate Director for Research Programs here, who's you've encountered, no doubt already, tireless, flawless administrator of all of this and our research events. Thank you very much. Also, I want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues on our steering committee of the Cultures of Conservation project, Alicia Boswell, Evan Gaskell, Aaron Glass, Jessica Walthu, Itai Weinrib, and Jennifer Maas, who joined us just this year and is an integral part of this. One of the fun but also very productive elements of this project has been its collective iterative process. Many of you have been invited by different people, and it's one of these moments where a single intellectual project is in fact the outcome of an ongoing conversation, which I think is better both for the project and also is a very good institutional model as well. Okay, enough of the logistics. Back to some intellectual matters. When I began a few minutes ago with the question, if bone is the answer, then what is the question? I took this from an article by Peter Fratzel because it succinctly gives us two things right off the bat. One is that what we are doing is a high-level hermeneutical project, And second, that its starting point is ultimately nature, a nature that's being understood today in ways that it never has been before. So a little bit more Fratzel at the beginning. We could call this bio-inspiration, though it's not just about observation of nature. It is about those hermeneutical facts, the boundary conditions that are built into nature. And therefore, he says, we need to keep our eyes open and must be able to solve a particular problem set, both the biological structure and the set of problems the structure is designed to solve can bio-inspire us. And I put this at the heart of the conception of active matter that we are working with here, because it grounds the humanistic part of the project in basic science in a way that I think is fundamental for us humanists who want to take the material world seriously as we do. And so from this, the idea is twofold. First, that what's happening now in material science can be a provocation to humanists who think about material culture, materials, materiality in general, and conservators, conservation science in particular. That there are things happening now, research being done, things being designed, built, proposed, that challenge basic and long-held and unexamined assumptions about what matter is, what agency or activity is, and what the relationship is between people and their environments. And second, that we should take this provocation as far as we can go with it and imagine not a slow series of incremental changes that might ensue, but a full-on, whole-hog evolution of the complete world that might operate on these principles. Of course, this may not happen soon. It may not even happen in this young century. As an aside, watching the new Blade Runner sequel, I was reminded that the original Blade Runner in 1982 was set in 2019, only 2 years from now, and there's no way that 2019 is going to look like they imagined it in 1982. So my question last night about thinking like in the 21st century is wrong. It probably should have been thinking as if in the 22nd century. But it's only at the extremes, which is to say it's only by being willing to play that we'll actually be able to fully explore the hermeneutical possibilities. Just to give an example, if we do imagine conservation in an active matter future, performing some kind of historian function, to evoke Foucault's author function, it's also the case that this ought to make those humanists who study past things realize that in their work, they perform a kind of conservation function of cultural heritage of things whose activity has led them to disappear materially, or convert into their resting, inert stage, which for a few centuries now we've been calling a source. So it's in this mind-bending direction, I give that just as one example, that this project ought to tend. Some of the bending is backward, too. So, for instance, this future conservator historian also meets up with a historian who's a conservator, and this takes us right back to 1935 and Heidegger's essay on the origin of the work of art, where he argues, and I quote, "The proper way to preserve the work is co-created and prescribed only and exclusively by the work. Preserving occurs at different levels of knowledge, with always differing degrees of scope, constancy, and lucidity. When works are offered merely for aesthetic enjoyment, this does not yet prove that they stand in preservation as works." In other words, we need to know the thing from itself in order to know it. This would also be another way of talking about the importance of experimental archaeology. But theoretically, on a more theoretical level, for an organization of knowledge that starts from how the things present themselves in the world as things, rather than, and this is a very gross contrast, rather than in terms of interdisciplinarity, whose premise ultimately is that the world presents itself to us in the form of discipline. For Deleuze, and I'm citing him out of Neil Leach's philosophical preface to MIT's Active Matter volume, this is the difference between a hylomorphic and a morphogenetic approach. Morphogenetic is taking the concepts out of the thing itself. But with morphogenesis, we're back to Goethe, the same Goethe who provides the epigram for the Berlin Group's manifesto of last year, Plus Ultra, now in English translation. I have a copy here to show you. Thank you for the copy. Moreover, and with this I'll step back from the precipice of what might feel to some of you like science fiction. In the world of active matter, it will be the conservator and conservation scientist who will be, and maybe we should say already are, confronted by challenges to fundamental concepts such as matter, activity, identity, agency, constitution, change, degradation, stabilization, even meaning, which means that we could consider conservators as kind of first responders to the epistemological challenge of the future. What conservators of the future will be forced to figure out will be helpful, maybe essential, to the humanists of the future. That's why our project is called Conserving Active Matter, because it's in focusing on the challenge facing conservation that we unlock this very rich conceptual landscape. Today, around this table in this room, is a kind of first pass at a sort of exploded view of the challenge of active matter, seen from the perspectives of history, philosophy, material science, and from that of indigenous ontologies, where the dichotomies generated by the Socratic turn, being, becoming, substance, intellect, active, passive, never got generated to begin with. These four axes of inquiry are each led by a different faculty member. So history by Itai, philosophy by Ivan, material science by Jennifer, and indigenous ontologies by Aaron. And now to a little view of the project. Over the next 2 years, each semester here will be devoted to, or given over to, a different group to schedule research events and plan teaching around those research events so as to continue to explore some of the themes to be discussed in this room today in the 4 panels. At the end of the 4 semesters, or 2 years of explorations, the group leaders will then begin to put together an exhibition project as the mode in which the outcome of this project, or interim outcome, will be presented to the public. And this exhibition making will be done in our focus program, which Ivan is the head of, and which this spring will be putting on its 14th and 15th exhibition. It's a student faculty curated exhibition program built around a course sequence. So what all this is about is only beginning to process some of the provocation of active matter. And it's about helping think through conservation as a field and to help conservators and conservation scientists as practitioners develop the kind of new conceptual muscles needed to work in this environment. And so, still on the level of outlining the project to you, that's why the second component of Conserving Active Matter is a fellowship program. It's a fellowship that will be jointly held at the BGC and in the Conservation and Scientific Research Department of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, and is targeted at beginning conservation professionals. The guiding idea, and it's Robert's main idea, and I should say the project really began because by accident, in this room 13 months ago, Wolfgang spoke here on a Tuesday about active matter, and Robert spoke here on a Wednesday. Wolfgang raised all of these questions. We were thinking at the time about our conservation project, and it seemed very interesting to imagine conservation in a world of active matter. And then Robert stood here and said that if he was king, and now he is king in his own little place, but if he were really king, he wouldn't conserve anything for 25 years and would spend, and would have, I guess, his staff spend a generation thinking about all of the questions involved in conservation. And so it's really in putting together Wolfgang's vision and Robert's that fed into what we are now working on. So the idea is that we've created this fellowship program to help young conservators think that what we are talking about today and what we talked about last night is actually the norm. It's the way that conservators should be thinking. In addition to their practice, this is part of the intellectual landscape. Conservation as a human science, which is what we call the fellowship project, means not only focusing on the life of objects as they interact with their human world, but also on the colleagues to whom conservators address their reflections. And so in this program, we want to model this idea by having the fellow each month lead a picked group of humanists to focus on a problem object in a different local collection. So each month it'll be a different object of a different type in a different kind of museum in New York and in Amsterdam. And the discussions launched by the conservator and curator from that institution will be recorded and edited for the Cultures of Conservation website. So that's my orientation for today, a little bit of concept and a little bit of the big picture about the project. And now I'd like to turn to the morning's speakers who represent our partner institutions in Berlin and in Amsterdam, the Helmholtz Center for Cultural Techniques, sounds much better in German, Kulturtechnik, and in Amsterdam, the Conservation and Scientific Research Department of the Rijksmuseum. I'm going to follow Alicia's model of last night, introduce all of the speakers at once, and then they will speak in turn afterwards, and that may or may not be the format used the rest of the day. My colleagues will decide what they themselves will prefer. So our first speaker, Peter Fratzel, who's coming to us from Berlin, is since 2003 the director at the Max Planck Institute of Colloids and Interfaces in the Department of Biomaterials in Potsdam. He's also honorary professor of physics at the Humboldt University and honorary professor of the physics of biomaterials at the University of Potsdam. He's co-director with Horst Bredekamp and Wolfgang Schäffner of the Cluster of Excellence Image Knowledge Gestaltung, an interdisciplinary laboratory, and currently serves as chair of the Chemistry, Physics, and Technology section of the Max Planck Society. His research fields are biomimetic materials research, in particular structure, function, relation in biological materials, bone and mineral research with biomedical applications such as to osteoporosis or bone regeneration, mechanical properties and the modeling of composite materials, in particular solid-state transformations. He's the author of almost 500 publications in scientific journals and books, and has given numerous lectures at conferences and institutions. Among the publications, I have seen 3, though I may have missed a few, in which one of our speakers from last night, Admir Mazic, is a co-author. In 2008, he received the Max Planck Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation. In 2010, he was recipient of the Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize from the German Science Foundation. And in 2015, he was elected a member of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Science and Humanities. Wolfgang Schäffner holds since 2009 the chair of the History and Culture of Knowledge in the Department of History and Theory of Culture at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He is the director of the Helmholtz Center for Kulturtechnik and co-directs with Horst Bredekamp and Peter Fratzel the Cluster of Excellence Image Knowledge Gestaltung. Also, since 2005, he has been a permanent visiting professor and director of the Walter Gropius Research Program in the Faculty of Architecture, Design, and Urbanism at the University of Buenos Aires, and director of the German Argentine MA program Open Design in Buenos Aires. His publications include a study of analog codes in the early modern period, of symbols and media from the punch card to grammatology, and interferences between science and art. Nienke Woltmann, to my right, graduated from the University of Amsterdam with a degree in art history and a master's degree and professional doctorate in conservation and restoration of paintings in 2012. She's worked as a freelance conservator and on projects for the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum and the Kunsthal in Rotterdam. She's been a junior paintings conservator at the Rijksmuseum since 2013. And as a conservator there, she's worked on restoration of paintings from the Turkish presidential painting collection. From 2014, she's been responsible for managing, assessing, and performing conservation work on paintings going out on loan. And finally, Abby Vanderveer has a BA from Princeton in art history, a postgraduate diploma in conservation from the Courtauld Institute in London, and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam on the history of oil painting in the Low Countries and its consequences for the visual arts 1350 to 1550. She's worked extensively in Dutch museums and lectured and published widely on this subject. Since 2015, she's been paintings conservator at the Mauritshuis Museum in The Hague and has coordinated the MA program in technical art history at the University of Amsterdam since 2013.
Thank you, Peter. What I try is to connect very directly with what you said, and also with respect to our historical difference as a material scientist and a humanist. In Germany, we have a nice description of humanities is Geisteswissenschaft, the science of the spirit, the immaterialities. So what I try to do and convert myself is to convert me into something like a immaterial and material scientist. And this is a challenge with respect to what I do and want to do, and what could change also the field, the triangle between sciences, design, and the humanities. Materials and their active structures can be seen as a permanent action and reaction with respect to their own internal coding and their environmental conditions. This is the real challenge for thinking artifacts, memory, and conservation. All the cases Peter showed us, in all the cases, there is interplay between material activity, its structure, and its function. Materials are machines, as the historian of science Bernadette Vincent points out. This is why the last case Peter Frotzsche showed us with Leonardo focuses on an important difference. Cultural and natural layer are not in unison, but interact in a dysfunctional way. The supposed material function of providing a stable and durable carrier for the painting is not really fulfilled. The material's active structure, the poplar wood that Leonardo used, is still active and producing a central crack and a general impact on the oil surface, oil color surface. The reason is simple: the material machine works in a different way. It cannot be turned off or shut down. It is not keeping still. But this only becomes a problem when you suppose to use it as a passive and stable carrier. Therefore, conservation is a real difficult task when it is regarded as a cultural technique for providing stable and durable material bases and carriers for the long-term storage of cultural information. We see as the preservation of cultural object is generally based on a passive material basis that should provide its stability and durability. Historically relevant objects are stored independently of the ongoing cultural practices for preventing them from wear and tear. This is especially possible in writing cultures, whereas oral cultures transmit their knowledge through practices and oral activities based on their repetitive active performance. Their storage is a type of stable transmission. In contrast to this, the idea of material saving and securing becomes difficult or even fails because of this inner activity and instability of the materials. In a media technological perspective, memory and the conservation of knowledge of the past depend on stable addresses and on the stable and passive material carrier that should be able to store cultural memory over long periods of time. From this point of view, it is no coincidence that since the early modernity, especially since the 18th century, the idea of passive materials has evolved in parallel with the idea of the one single history as a grid and container for storing its testimonies in archives and museums. Also, the extension of time and its increasing abyss reveals time as a special factor impact. The question was how to keep memory and transmit it over long periods of time, above all when historical time is fading into prehistoric, archaeological, and geological ages. In any case, the material basis, however, seems to be solid, passive, and its solidity promises durability. Active matter destroys this idea of material storage. To understand the radical impact of active matter in the field of memory and conservation, it is helpful to have a look at the idea of passive matter and how it is above all developed during 19th century, when in a parallel way conservation was established, is establishing objects of cultural heritage as durable, unalterable, passive objects of memory. Oops. It doesn't work. So I go on in meanwhile. Materials are a necessary condition for cultural practices. Activity is directed towards the material substrate that is set in motion. No, it's going on. Activity is directed towards a material substrate that is set in motion by an external drive, be it through thoughts to steer the body's action and take shape as letters on paper, or be it through energies that must be supplied to activate devices against their own inertia and material weight. This antagonism is omnipresent as mind and body, symbolic and physical, operative code and material carrier, digital and material. The chain of action always leads from the agent to its embodiment, from the idea and its design to its realization and materialization. Almost all our modern technologies and cultural techniques are based on this dichotomy, which has been a fundamental axis of our entire culture since the 18th century at the latest. And all this is also the case when we refer to the techniques of memory. Immanuel Kant formulated this principle as both physical and epistemological fact in 1766. Dead matter, he says, which fills space, is by its own nature capable of inertia and stability in all kinds of condition. It has solidity, extension, and figure. Matter's passivity appears to be absolutely unavoidable, since an active or living matter, on the other hand, provokes to be completely unthinkable, as Kant once again formulates in all clarity in his critique of judgment. But the possibility of living matter, whose term contains a contradiction because lifelessness, inertia constitutes the essential character of it, cannot even be thought of. The technical revolution of the 19th century and 20th century up to the digital techniques became possible due to the principle of passive materials. Hardware, as classical ironware, has penetrated all areas of life with its passivity, and it's still being implemented to an unprecedented degree. The digital completes the radical passivation of matter, even in the most recent developments and visions of digital perfectly malleable matter. If materials are to be programmable as completely as pixels on a screen, it is not active matter in the sense of self-activity, but rather the inscription of an external active control into passive materials down to the molecular level. In the context of the Industrial Revolution, the fact that matter is regarded inert and passive also created a great need for energy and electricity in order to enable extensive mechanization and technical activation of the purely passive material basis. The 19th century thus became a new era of iron. In his Arcades project, Walter Benjamin shows how Paris was fundamentally changed by the technical absolutism of the iron constructions. As a new building material, increasingly replacing wood, iron became the basis of a new architecture. The systematic industrial process which converts raw material into immediately available building materials begins with iron at a much earlier stage than with previously existing building materials. Between matter and material, in this case, there's a relationship quite different from that between stone and ashlar, clay and tile, timber and beam. With iron, building materials and structural form are more homogeneous. The iron buildings of the 1889 Paris World Exhibition, in particular the Eiffel Tower and the Galerie des Machines, are exemplary models. Siegfried Gideon's description of the beams of the Galerie des Machines illustrates that in a peculiar way. The last hint of the column has disappeared. There is no possibility of palpating the jump where the load or support merge. The curvature begins deep down, crouched as in a jump to receive the load. The ends of the downwardly sharpening beams are no longer rigidly connected to the ground. They can move freely. They transfer their weight and the horizontal thrust of 120,000 kilograms directly into the foundation via an ankle joint. At this supporting structure, even fundamental movements could occur without inner forces. It was the only way to control the interplay of forces in all its aspects of the system. In contrast to all classical design, iron construction shows a peculiar dynamic. Such an interplay of forces, however, is only possible on the absolute reliable and passive material basis, which fulfills exactly the static requirements. For this reason, this building in Gideon's description seems to be less static architecture than a machine which with great effort uses rigid iron beams to fasten its internal forces. Immobility and statics, one could say, is a highly dynamic process. The spatial revolution of the 20th century architecture, however, goes a decisive step further when the material building structure perform their dynamics in a very direct sense as pursued by Buckminster Fuller since the 1920s. This becomes possible precisely when material is no longer understood as a passive matter but as a set of operative mechanisms. Fuller has discarded architecture precisely in this sense of passive materiality. I often hear, I said in our technical schools and by the public that architects build buildings out of materials. I point out to architectural students that they do not do that at all. The kind of definition dates back to the era of men's thinking matter as solid. I tell architectural students that what they do is to organize the assemblage of visible modular structures out of subvisible modular structures. Nature itself, at the chemical level, does the prime structuring. If the patterning attempted by the architect is not inherently associative with the local regenerative dynamics of chemical structure, his buildings will collapse. Fuller's rejection of the idea of solid and passive matter focuses the necessary integration of natural and artificial structures and the homogeneity of material and form. If the patterning attempted by the architect is not inherently connected with the inner architecture of the material, as he said, the building will collapse. Looking back to Leonardo, that means if the painting produced by the painter is not inherently associative with the local generative dynamics of the wood plate, his painting will crack. That is, the design of memory through external implementation of a formal symbolic sphere into matter is failing. Interestingly, material sciences, wherein today the idea of active matter has been developed historically, builds on the great era of iron, since it was developed from metallurgy, in which the special properties of the materials began to be explained by its microstructure. Compared to the homogeneous structures of metals and stones, biological materials in particular show even more active functions, which can be used as models for the new bio-inspired technologies. Within this context, traditional knowledge about the working of wood was fundamentally renewed, analyzing the internal structure responsible for its activity. Wood as hylae is in a way the exemplary material. It can either be understood as particularly flexible and active, or it can be used as a rigid material, as plywood, for example. If on the one hand all classical objects and construction elements require the most rigid and passive wood possible, as in the case of Leonardo, on the other hand, the working wood has also been made usable in its activity in many ways. For example, in shipbuilding, when the wood swelling through water first joined the individual parts of the hull to form the dense body, or similarly in the manufacture of wooden barrels. Here, the special moisture induced activity of the wood is not neutralized, but rather forms an essential function as an active material. And this pavilion of Archimedes shows exactly how he uses wood no longer as a stiff material, but as a sensor and a motor as such. It is obvious that cultural conservation and passive memory will be fundamentally challenged when materials themselves are not at all passive, but consists of an inherent inner activity. Nevertheless, museum experts are long since aware of this material instability of their objects. However, they struggle to find the most stable form of these materials to inactivate dysfunctional activities of the materials that could disturb the long-term storage. But all the efforts still are based on the general idea of fixing and storing historical content as durable material objects. Materials are not passive carriers or hardware for cultural codes if these are external to the operating system of the material and not inherently associated with the material, as Fuller said. Material-based cultural storage is not only relevant for physical objects, but applies in Western culture equally to classical text documents, images, sound documents, or any kind of digital objects. The material impact and its possible instabilities are always considered dysfunctional. Alternations and unintended changes within the material basis disturb or even destroy the memory. This becomes even more evident in the storage of photographic images and in sound storage, both inventions of the 19th century and thus ways of freezing highly dynamic and volatile facts into fixed state. Above all, the early photography plates and their light-sensitive surface, as well as the wax cylinders of the analog sound recording systems, are extremely unstable in terms of usage and durability. Their lifespan has long since expired, and they can only survive through permanent restorage in other systems. Peter Fratzel focus on conserved natural activity within materials. However, changes this idea of frozen and immobilized elements as a basis of cultural memory. This natural principle used is that geometric structures inherently store, so to say, possible activities that can be released at any moment. The material structure is coded for repeating its coded activity in the future when the necessary triggering conditions take place. Code is here no longer an alphanumeric operation, but an analog 3D or 4D code, where the immaterial and the symbolic emerges within matter as such. The natural system of storage works in the following way. The structure materializes certain processes and is able to reanimate, to reenact them anytime. Thus, the material itself can be regarded as an analogically coded procedure that acts as storage and of processes. In the case of the seeds of the ice plant or the Banksia folix, this hardware is responsible for memory storage in a second order, when the information of the seed will be activated just when the hardware of the covering material triggers the possible activation of the seed. Active material thus does not store the state of something past, no object or entity, but a process. The disadvantage of the instability of active matter can be transformed into the advantage of designing storable activities as a new kind of stability over long periods of time. Such a conserving process would fundamentally change cultural heritage. Instead of transforming an important historical building into an object of cultural heritage and start with a permanent conservation process, the building could be stored through the code of its own construction. As in the case of Japanese temple architecture, which are not declared monuments but rebuilt every 25 years to store the building process and not the building for long periods over time, thus generating a more stable storage through the permanent transmission. This is a way of combining cultural and natural activities on the level of materials in a functional and productive way. If the storing strategy allows to inherently combine the dynamics of the material activity and the cultural activity, this conjunction can be regarded as a storage process and a stable storage process. Processes, however, also will suffer alternations and mutations when they adapt to the environmental conditions. But adaptation is, as we learn from nature's procedures, generating stability through change. Let me conclude. Stability is emerging as a higher order within active structure when everything is transforming and fading away. Therefore, the analysis of long-term storage can be helpful for figuring out the possible future of memory and conserving in the age of active matter. I think geometry can be such an object. The textbook of the elements, written around 300 before Christ, as a textual document, is completely lost in transmission over time. The most original material document is a fragment from 400 years after its conception. In early modernity, the author of the elements was supposed to be an Arab due to the predominant existence of Arabic versions. But also our Euclid is not a historical object, but created by the philologist Johann Heiberg in 1883 through the synopsis of a large number of different versions. There are a lot of controversies about Heiberg's version. It is also seen as a wrong Euclid. Nevertheless, the geometric code was transmitted in a stable way over more than 2,300 years, not on the basis of a textual document, but on a level of practices and instruments as an active procedure that does not depend on the human being. Greek geometry, as Michel Serres wrote in his essay on the gnomon, was never, as he said, related to a thinking subject and was never thought in a context of idealism. Remember also Fuller's building structures that are at the same time natural geometries, an analog code that goes beyond our alphanumeric system. The elements, the Euclidean elements, do not exist in any museum, but their geometric practices are omnipresent in culture and nature. The challenge we have to face is to think that this total loss of the very original material object of the Euclidean elements is a highly successful transmission and conservation that can serve us in the same sense as a model for active process storage as the seeds and the activity stored in natural materials. These powerful models for the design of future memory, these are powerful models for the design of future memory and the redesign of the past. Thank you.
So yeah, as you know, Robert van Lang is not going to be here, but we are here. Is this on? Is this on? Yeah. I'll start to talk a bit about the conservation department of the Rijksmuseum. Robert van Lang is head of this department, and about our methodology, and then Abby will continue about NICAS. Let's see. Ah yeah, there we are. So the Conservation Department of the Rijksmuseum, which is currently also called the Scientific Research Department, but I keep forgetting it, but so forgive me for that. It's housed in the Atelier building, which is on the Museum Square, just across the Rijksmuseum, and in the same building are also located the research departments of the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency, and the University Program for Conservation of the University of Amsterdam. And with these three organizations, the Atelier building has become a center of expertise for restoration and preservation, scientific practice, research and education. Then to the Conservation Department of the Rijksmuseum. We have several disciplines which are listed here, and furthermore there are technical art historians, material and data scientists, fellows, postdocs, etc. There's a total of about 75 people working in the department at the moment. The general vision of the Conservation Department is based on the idea that we want to better understand the diverse collection but at the same time that it needs optimal visibility at the museum. There are three pillars that, that the vision is based on. The first is that treatments of intervention will only be carried out if the decay processes and the treatments have been scientifically investigated as completely as possible. And then when interventions are carried out, the first aim is to stabilize the object and to make sure that the object forms an aesthetic whole whenever appropriate. I'm aware of the fact that the term stable is a bit problematic. With it, I don't mean to make active matter passive, but in conservation, the truth is that we use the term almost daily without actually realizing that nothing ever is stable. But that's probably another discussion. I think for us, stable will mean or equals the fact that you can handle and show an object without visual damage occurring or without maybe even parts falling off. And then the final pillar is reversibility. So we want to fully understand if the material composition of the object is changed by our treatments and the extent to which the treatments can be reversed without changing the object. Well, with all these different conservation specialists and scientists, it's a challenge to all work according to the same methodology. But that is what we are trying to formulate at the moment, led by Robert van Lang. The conservation department is trying to create this shared methodology. And although all the types of work are very different, the aim is to bring some structure in the decisions that are being made in the process. And the decision of treatment, for example, should take place according to the following aspects. Physical properties, so the damage, degradation, and again, the stability of the object. The aesthetical properties, the possibility to experience an object, and of course the historical properties. And based on these three criteria and thorough scientific research, we should then do a risk analysis in which the necessity, the risk, the expected effect, and the consequences of the treatment should be taken into account. The activities and research that are taking place at the conservation department give results and information that are interesting for the audience, and an important part of our new methodology is that what we do should be visible. Here you can see an example of research that was carried out in the museum galleries, where a large painting by Rembrandt is being scanned with a macro XRF scanner. And this was last year, and surprisingly new to the traditional Rijksmuseum policy, because there are a few people in our museum that are afraid that the museum visitors will not understand or not care about material aspects of art. And this trial has shown that the visitors, of course, do care and do think it's very interesting. And we really hope that from now on, the research and the treatments that we carry out will be or become a fixed part of the museum experience. Because also in this way we can increase the visitor's appreciation for the material or the materiality of the objects, and also the fact that that's changing. And while we have been formulating our new methodology, which we share with conservators and scientists, the need to reflect on what we do and why has become more obvious. And I'm speaking on behalf of Robert, or actually I'm not, but I'm interpreting his ideas. So the combination of applied scientific research on the one hand and practical knowledge on the other has become one of the characteristic properties of the conservation discipline. The exchange of experiences and ideas has grown so much in the past decades, and more new analytical research methods have been developed and have become common to use by conservators. The collaboration of conservators and material and data scientists has luckily become a daily practice, at least in our institute. But now that everything that we want can be investigated, Robert really feels, and I agree with him, the necessity to connect to the human sciences as well, because that is something that we're not doing actually. And by doing so, we need to interpret and give meaning to our research results, and at the same time reflect upon that meaning. And that is a reason why, while developing our new methodology, Robert is very happy to be part of this initiative, especially now.
Great, thanks. So my name is Abby Vandeveer, and I'm a member of the advisory board for the scientific committee of NICAS, and that is the Netherlands Institute for Conservation, Art and Science. And Robert van Lang is also the chair of NICAS. And since he can't be here today, I'll do my best to explain its missions and projects. And this will give you an idea of the research environment that the Active Matter Fellow will experience when they are in Amsterdam. So NICAS is an interdisciplinary research center dedicated to the study of and care for cultural heritage. And under the board of the NWO, that's the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, NICAS has 4 organizations as lead partners. The Rijksmuseum, obviously, the Cultural Heritage Institute of the Netherlands, the University of Amsterdam, and the Delft University of Technology. The main hub is the Atelier building, and that's the building that Nienke also described earlier. NICAS brings together researchers from different disciplines to engage in research projects, and it aims to unite art historians, conservators, and scientists. It consolidates and develops the connections between these disciplines in the form of a cohesive research program. And this happens in close cooperation with and with the active involvement of the cultural heritage field. So problems that we encounter in Dutch museums are used as input and inspiration for the research that takes place under NICAS. The ultimate goal is a better understanding, presentation, and conservation of artworks. So far, there have been 2 rounds of calls for proposals for NICAS, where researchers from the lead partner institutions, but also other institutions, pitch seed money and multi-year project concepts that fit within an overall theme. And the most recent call focused on data science. So data experts and IT specialists of all different types will work with art historians and conservators to explore how computing can be used to interpret and visualize cultural heritage information in new ways. And also, on the other hand, the questions that art historians and conservators pose can challenge these data scientists to develop new technologies and applications to deal with the different types of data that we are acquiring. So if I enlarge this last brown box on the slide, you can see some examples of how data science is already being used by the Rijksmuseum's dedicated data scientist, Rob Erdman. He and his colleagues have developed and implemented these and other tools to work with the huge amounts of data that one museum produces. So some examples here. We have weave angle maps in the top left, where the warp and weft of canvas fibers are plotted in the different directions and their density is measured. And that can be used, among other things, to match up canvas from different paintings that may have come from the same roll. On the top right, correlating data about color information and elemental information, bringing that together within one painting, for example, Rembrandt's Jewish Bride here, but bringing together different types of data and making a visualization that will allow you to look at the information in new ways. In the bottom left, overlaying images captured with different instruments during a technical examination and displaying them in different ways, including what Rob likes to describe as a curtain viewer or a multi-mode image viewer, where you can shift between these different images very subtly or quickly so that your eye doesn't have a time delay or a lapse in going from one image to the next. And in the bottom right here, grouping data in ways that enable art historians or other researchers to compare specific motifs. So for example, here are all of the hands in paintings by Hieronymus Bosch, and they can be arranged in different ways. They're all scaled together, and looking at all of them together allows you to find out new things by comparison. So to zoom back to the big picture, in future years, the research focus might shift away from data science, but will always include data science. But Nikos will always endeavor to answer questions that involve art historical scholarship, social science, conservation practice, conservation science, physical science, and data science. And to achieve this, Nikos has formulated 4 main research challenges that form the basis for the overall research program. So first we have technical art history, which is making use of new possibilities in science and technology to confront problems and questions within art history. So conventional art historical questions might be dealt with in new ways, and fruitful new questions can be opened up. Secondly, we have conservation dynamics, and that's perhaps most relevant to what we're discussing today, where the aim is to raise the level of conservation practice by bridging the gap between fundamental scientific developments and hands-on conservation methods by developing new and innovative strategies. Thirdly, diagnostics, to develop new diagnostic tools and technologies for researching cultural heritage objects. And also the aim is to develop new or to use evolving technologies and bring them into the museum and cultural heritage fields. And actually this is the one that is most relevant today, material dynamics, and that's to understand and predict the long-term material degradation of artworks. And models can be developed to depict the past of an art object based on what we know about its present, and then predict the future conditions of objects. And I'll go into one example of that later in this presentation. So far there have been 2 rounds of calls where the selective projects have covered wide-ranging topics like lead isotope analysis, predicting the aging of oil networks, Delftware ceramic glazes, gilt leather artifacts, and characterizing organic polymers on metal substrates, to give you an idea. I personally am involved in this project, which is taking place under the umbrella of Nikos, and that is the technical examination of Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring. And as a paintings conservator at the Mauritshuis in The Hague, I'm coordinating a team of scientists and researchers from many different national and international institutions, including all 4 of Nikos's lead partners. In the last few months, we've been re-examining samples that were first taken and analyzed in the 1990s during the last period in which this painting was restored, conserved. And these were analyzed by scientists from the RCE, the National Cultural Heritage Organization. And at that time, their research questions were connected to the conservation treatment. And they used the techniques that they had at their disposal to find out about the materials and techniques. Since then, our analytical capabilities have improved tremendously, but also our research questions have changed. Now we are focusing almost exclusively on Vermeer's materials and techniques, as we don't have plans to treat this painting again anytime soon. So over a 2-week period in late February, early March 2018, we will conduct a technical examination of the girl with a pearl earring in front of the public at the Mauritshuis. And this will serve to educate the museum public about the latest non-invasive technical advances that we have to examine artworks. And I'll refer back to Nienke's presentation where she showed the XRF scanning happening in the galleries. And we'll also capture the condition of this specific artwork at this specific moment in time. And who knows, in the future, this sort of technical examination could be carried out again using the high-tech techniques that have yet to be developed. Because as we know, even old paintings continue to be active matter. The dimensional changes in the support, lead soap formation, for instance, that originates in the ground layers, discoloration and deterioration of the paint layers. These are all things that we can limit by keeping the paintings in a stable condition within a museum environment, but they still continue to happen. So Nikos has made this project possible by offering the time and the expertise of researchers from the Rijksmuseum, the RCE, TU Delft, among others. And they'll also lend analytical equipment like the macro XRF scanner that will be used to investigate the elements of the painting materials at and below the surface of the painting. So if you have any questions specifically about the Girl with the Pearl Earring project, please talk to me today about it. If you would like any more information about Nikos, you're better off looking at the website, and you can obviously contact Robert at a later time, and the rest of his team that is working to make these important projects happen. And I hope that the collaboration between Bard and the Rijksmuseum, and by extension, Nikos, will result in more of these fruitful projects. So, thank you.
So thanks to our speakers. We have 7 minutes left for questions. I should say none of us felt that we didn't want questions, but we also have the professionals understanding that the best questions always occur during the coffee breaks. And therefore, we decided to maximize the coffee breaks. I'm afraid, Peter, in Berlin, that's not going to help you very much, or us either, from you. But that does mean we have 7 minutes here for some questions around the table. And so the floor is now open.
Thank you very much for a very interesting session. My question is directed to Professor Scheffner. I wanted to ask you, I mean, I think your idea of the transmission through construction process is extremely interesting. And your example of geometry is excellent. I think another example is the storage of Chinese archives that went on in the rewriting of imperial documents and histories, etc. The only problem is that we need really both kinds of storage, because the transmission, only the transmission kind of forecloses the historian's ability to focus on discrete singular moments. And, you know, it's a huge problem, or a very different problem that's confronted by historians of Europe and historians of China because of the nature, you know, because of that cultural transmission that happened, or the practices of transmission that happened in China, and versus the archival storage in Europe, for example. So just comments on that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the problem is always when material is involved, it can be transformed into a more stable way when the interaction between the basis, the natural material basis, and the cultural activities are more productive. I mean, this is something which is not working in our classical cultural objects. Therefore, Peter Frotzel's examples are very, very nice, since when he talks about that the seed is waiting for a future fire or something, we have to admit that this storage of something has a symbolic order within the material structure. So that the symbolic order is nothing outside what we have to implement as a strange aspect into matter and make it behave according to this. The symbolic jumps out of matter. I think this is this new idea of converging natural and cultural activities, what we can see today more than ever since before, and therefore I like so much working with Peter Frotzel when we try to talk about code. Peter Frotzel always was talking about code. Normally we think more as a cultural activity, but this is he's talking about matter and materials, I think, and to take advantage of this makes necessary to change our cultural codes in order to make it fit better to the support and the material where we can realize it.
I get it, but it seems like something is lost. That was my only point in actually writing history.
Can I bring up a small point? I think what we did not talk about so much is that dynamics or conservation is also a matter of perception. I mean, it depends on how you look at things, whether you use X-rays or whether you use infrared or our own eyes or touch or any kind of function. So, I mean, what is the central thing in terms of conservation in your context? Is it mostly human perception, or does it go deeper somehow?
Is this question directed to? So, if I understand your question correctly, is conservation?
So, I can try again. I have the impression I didn't get it across. So, whether something is conserved is a matter of how you look at it, let's put it that way, no? Whether it's visual or infrared or X-ray or touch or so on and so on. So all the dynamics cannot be influenced at the same time. So I think conservation has to be put in the context of what kind of perception and what kind of, is that correct? And how do you deal with this problem? Because you may conserve something in one aspect, and then looking at it in a different way will be strongly changed.
Yes, I think I understand your question now. Of course, these are all things we have to take into account whenever anything is done with an artwork, from removing it from its frame to handling it to conducting a more, let's say, invasive treatment. We have to balance out the long-term longevity of a work of art, whether intervening at this moment is the appropriate time, whether this is something that can be assessed in the future, and always having to remember that when we are examining an object, we are getting a glimpse of it at this moment in time, and that the changes also need to continue to be monitored. To sort of spin off of your question a little bit, certain changes that happen within an artwork, I'll talk about paintings from now on, some of them happen without any intervention from the conservator. For instance, the development of lead soaps within paint layers, or emanating from ground layers and moving up through the paint. On the one hand, we've become very aware of how this can cause detrimental effects to paintings all over the world, but the Netherlands has been very focused on lead soap research. The migration of soaps to the surface can create craters, sort of pimples in the paint layer that manifest themselves as inclusions on the surface. But this process also creates better cohesion in paint layers. It has both a detrimental effect and a positive effect, that it makes the paint layer more stable over the course of time. So that also refers back to your question that interventions and natural processes have both a positive and a negative side, and these are definitely things that we have to balance out and that we have to be aware of.
And if I could just jump in, thinking about Pamela's question to Wolfgang, it's not only true that the different kinds of conservation methods raise the issue of what is being conserved and on what basis, but trying to conserve insofar as it takes, let's say, an object out of circulation or out of access to people who might use it, using Wolfgang's example, also imperils the object. So think about classical texts that survived in a single manuscript copy, often quite damaged, like the famous stories of Poggio in St. Gallen finding unique manuscripts. There, the attempt to preserve actually imperiled the object, because in fact storage in human minds is a very good way of preserving something. So I think the question is a very deep one.
I have a question for Professor Fratzel. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So I'm a philosopher, and a lot of this material is very new to me. I really enjoyed your presentation. And I want to ask about the very notion of movement being encoded in a structure. So I don't quite understand the difference between a structure's having a capacity to move under certain conditions and movements being encoded in a structure.
Okay.
That
Well,
seems
let
like
me comment. Yeah. Let me try. So if you imagine just a swellable gel, something that takes up water, it would swell equally in all dimensions. And just now by putting fibers, say, in vertical direction, it will now swell only horizontally because it cannot in vertical. If you put the fibers in horizontal direction, it will just do the opposite. So depending on how you put the fibers, the same thing will move in a different way. And so in that sense, I think the architecture is encoding the movement, because depending on how it is put, despite the fact that you haven't changed anything in the composition of the material, you just have changed the arrangement of some of the components, it will do something different. Does this make sense?
But isn't this true for everything? Isn't it? No, really. I mean, isn't it true that if I just change the structure of this pen a little bit, it might, float or something? So I don't see how. I feel like you want to isolate something very specific.
Yeah. Well, I think, but it goes beyond that, because I can predict what's happened by what I'm doing. So if I decide to put the fibers in a certain direction, then I force the material to do something that I'm prescribing. In that sense, it's an encoding. An encoding is just a way where I can put in a behavior in a predictable way. If it's not predictable, it's not encoding. It's the fact that I can completely predict. Of course, you can encode other behaviors, but I think this in particular is just, like if you take a computer code, it's just zeros and ones, but it's a sequence of zeros and ones that will tell the machine to behave in a specific way. And in the same way, it's just fibers in a soft gel that by putting the fibers in the right direction will tell the gel how to move. In this sense, I think it's encoding.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like could I just follow up really quickly? It seems like there's a notion of intention floating behind.
Well, if I'm doing this in an engineering context, of course there's an intention. I would not talk about intention in a natural context, because there is evolution and sort of natural selection and so on. But still, it's connected to a function, and sort of these structures have been selected by, say, Darwinian processes for certain functions. So, for example, all the movements that I showed for these seeds, these are movements by which these seeds, when they fall down from the plant, are able to move along the ground to be planted 5 meters away from the mother plant. That's how they disseminate in nature. So this is a big advantage. if you cannot grow, because these plants do not run, yeah, they are just stationary, so their seeds are running. This is the advantage. So this function is something that provided an advantage, and therefore, so intention in engineering and say selection in nature. So that's how I would at least see it.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
So I think with that, we've come to the end of the morning session. I'd like to thank, first of all, Peter Fratzel in Berlin. You're a wonderful presence. Thank you very much. And my panelists
Thank
to
you
left
very
and
much.
right. And thank you. And we now have 24 minutes to caffeinate. Thank you all very much.